Welcome to another episode of Safer Communities Canada, where we have authentic, real conversations with people who are helping enhance and improve the institutions. Today we have a very, very special guest. We're honored to have Dr. Akwasi Owusu-Bempah. Here is his bio, and we're going to have some very rich conversations. So he's an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto and a senior fellow at Massey College. He holds affiliate scientist status at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health and serves as race equity lead at the Center on Drug Policy Evaluation. Dr. Owusu-Bempah's work examines the intersection of race, crime, and criminal justice, which really aligns well with some of the work we do here at YACE. His current research spans across criminal justice institutions, specifically leading the Black Justice Strategy, which we have a visual here. If you haven't checked it out, very timely and needed to be familiar with. He's also studying various aspects of drug legalization in Canada and around the world. He publishes regularly in both academic and popular forums. And he began his academic career in the United States at Indiana University, Bloomington. Prior to becoming a professor, he held many positions, both with Canada's National Judicial Institute, the Public Health Agency of Canada, and Ontario's Ministry of the Solicitor General. So he brings that rich perspective, having been in so many of these leadership roles. He's frequently sought out to provide commentary advice to police agencies, government bodies, community organizations, and media outlets on matters relating to justice, policing, and social inequalities. His latest book is entitled Waiting to Inhale, Cannabis Legalization and the Fight for Racial Justice. Welcome, and thanks for coming here, given your busy schedule.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be able to sit down with the real experts.
Awesome. So, we always start out with a question where we want to learn a little bit about your journey, because we know a lot of work goes into how you arrive in these spaces. And so can you start us by just telling us about, who you are, your journey into community safety space from all these different entry points and roles?
Yeah, so as you noted, I'm a professor now, but took kind of a long while to get to where I am. Initially, when I was young, I thought I'd actually go work in the criminal justice system itself. First thought about policing, which is what drew me to study criminology. And I did that at Carleton University, and pretty quickly realized that what I thought policing was very different from the reality, and especially the issues that I now focus on in my research. Racism within policing in terms of how they deal with the public, as well as within policing itself, like the experiences of Black and other racialized officers, were going to be harder to deal with and to tackle than I initially appreciated. So I gave up those hopes and dreams and thought government might be a better idea. I realized that government would be no less frustrating.
Oh, wow.
But still very much committed to addressing issues of racial equity and inequality, and especially in the criminal justice system itself. And discovered that becoming an academic was going to give me a lot of freedom, a lot of latitude to kind of do the work that I wanted to do. Choice over what I studied, and importantly, like the ability and the agency to engage with the justice sector kind of more on my terms, and to say things about the justice sector that I wouldn't be able to had I been working within it. So that undergrad degree where I realized that policing and justice weren't going to work for me, and kind of the experience in government led to grad school, and then in grad school I began kind of studying in real depth policing, and from there expanded throughout the criminal justice system, and I've had the opportunities you've kind of noted to work in different places and collaborate with people both within the justice sector and in community as well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Just as a follow-up, did you have any specific experiences growing up that stuck with you, or some sort of jobs you had that kind of moved you to say, you know what, I want to do advocacy work in community safety? Like, is there something that stuck with you, or was it more accumulation of all of those pieces?
I would say it was actually more kind of personal. So my father, who ultimately became a professor as well, had a number of different jobs. He worked in mental health. He was a registered nurse for the mentally ill for quite some time in England, and he actually ran, I lived in Leicester, the city of Leicester's Race Awareness Council for a long time. And so he would do work within the justice sector as well. My mom was fairly active in the anti-apartheid movement at the time too, and so those personal experiences I think really kind of gave me a certain mindset to go into this work, and then for me it was just kind of exploring where it was that I would go with it.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Sounds good. Welcome.
Thank you.
Akwasi. And I want to congratulate you on the work that you have done with the Black Justice Strategy, a well-written document with many recommendations, 114 to be exact.
That's right.
And we have gone through it, yes, and identify 24, which is consistent with the work that we do. How comfortable are you with the fact that Public Safety Canada and DOJ will buy into the recommendations that you have made as it relates to how Black Canadians are impacted by justice, by the justice
Yeah,
system?
it's a good question. And first, I think I got to recognize that I was a co-author and co-chaired the steering group.
Yes,
but
yes.
we were a large group of people, so it was very much a collaborative effort. And I think importantly, the recommendations and the material contained not only in the strategy itself, but actually the framework document too, really drew on the huge amount of work that had been done over decades prior to us writing the strategy, and with the input of members of Black communities from across the country. So I think that's really important to acknowledge too. My level of comfort with how much the Department of Justice and Public Safety will buy into those recommendations, for me, are really still yet to be seen. The work that we did was led in terms of a government by a body within the Department of Justice, and so there was a team, a Black Justice Strategy team established to do this work. And then we had inputs from different government agencies, including Public Safety Canada. I think, like any organization, like any government institution, there are going to be people within that institution whose views, experiences, and perhaps desires align with the recommendations that we've put forth, and especially those that relate to those institutions in particular, so DOJ and Public Safety. And then you've got the reality of the broader institutions themselves and people who don't. So it's kind of my way of answering your question without really answering your question. We delivered the report earlier in the year. It was published over the summer. We still haven't seen much yet in the way of anything tangible from either the DOJ or Public Safety in terms of what they intend to do with these recommendations. So, perhaps the delay in getting anything out to either those who are engaged in the work or to the public may send an indication as to the level of commitment. But at the same time, if they're taking things very seriously and trying to establish something elaborate based on those recommendations, perhaps that would take some time. So, I've got a great amount of faith in the work. I think that the report produced was a strong one. And I recognize that there are, again, people in government who would want to see these recommendations carried out. And then we've got, kind of political timelines and horizons to consider as well. And so there's kind of a lot at play here. But, my hopes is that those recommendations will be taken seriously. And, there are kind of the overarching recommendations relating to DOJ and to public safety that I really hope would be implemented. And then there are, of course, the more nuanced recommendations that flow after those overarching recommendations relating to each of those bodies too. And much work for each organization to be done.
Okay, quick question. Did you get a chance to share the report with either of those departments?
So we were, Zilla and I were co-authoring this, and again with the input of the steering committee, and that we delivered to the Department of Justice. So this work was done out, essentially out of the Department of Justice, but by us as the steering group and the co-authors. So we did not get an opportunity to share it directly with or to speak to, for example, Public Safety on it. I could have, of course, on my own accord, sent it to the ministers involved and the bureaucrats responsible for the work, but in terms of the opportunity to do so, no, that wasn't there.
Okay.
And I mean, for me, 114 recommendation, it is quite a lot. So if the average person said, you know what, if you had to advocate and ride or die for 3 of them as priorities, I know you had in the report, you have the overarching themes, which are early on. What 3 would you say you would like to see some investments and prioritization to get us started?
So I was very much wedded to those overarching recommendations, and especially the first 5 of those. So if they came at me, I said there was 114. They said pick 3. I said I'll give you 5, and it would be the first 5. And those first 5 recommendations, and I can take 3 from those, but those first 5 recommendations are really about establishing bodies both within and outside of government that are going to support and address the needs of Black communities, right? Like if I take this back again, I mentioned that this work is really, we were standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Like we've had dozens of reports, of course, hundreds, if not thousands of recommendations within the justice sector and beyond, focusing on issues to address the needs of Black, and there's some overlap with Indigenous communities, of course, right? So in many ways, we know, and we knew going into this what needed to be done. I don't think we necessarily needed to reiterate it. What we do need is the structures and systems in place to actually implement those. Yeah. And those overarching recommendations were really about establishing those structures and those systems to implement those recommendations, and importantly, to kind of monitor. So I would say, again, data. People say, well, do we need data? We know what's up. Well, yeah, like we kind of need data to assess the full extent to which something is happening, to monitor changes, whether positive or negative, and to look at what up or downstream is happening when you're looking at a particular issue. So, I would say those overarching recommendations, and the first 5 of those, and again, those were about establishing bodies inside and outside of government that would help to support and address and identify ongoing the needs of Black communities across this country.
Yeah, and again, we thank you for the you and your co-author for the report, because some of the said recommendations we shared with public safety prior in November, prior to reading the report. For example, number 3, establishing a division within Public Safety Canada that deals with the well-being and issues pertaining to Black Canadians.
And again, even those recommendations, those weren't novel, right? Like those recommendations had been tabled before. It was really given the platform that we had to do this, giving them the prominence that they should have. But yeah, I think in that I will say, like, I was really wedded to a small number of impactful recommendations. In hindsight, I think that there was a benefit to some that were a bit more nuanced, because it does allow organizations, you said you'd gone with those before the report was even tabled, but it does allow organizations to go to government to say, like to seek funding or to seek partnerships to address specific needs, because they have been highlighted in a report like this. So there's some, some utility to having done so. 114 is a lot, though. I hear a lot of people say, like, there's a lot to get lost in the weeds there. And I would agree. It's a lot of recommendations, but we were trying to cover a lot of ground. And one of the things that I want to say as well, kind of about the way in which we structure the recommendations, we'll get there in a little bit, but is really around those social determinants of justice too, right? Like this work was being done with out of essentially the Department of Justice, but like how do you address issues related to crime, violence, and overrepresentation within the criminal justice system without looking beyond it, right? Crime and criminal justice issues don't operate in a vacuum. They're connected to other issues, and we'll get there, but that I think was key too.
I mean, I think for me, what I love about it at the table here is there's community perspective, there's the academic perspective, there's the institutions who are trying to say, where do we invest, what's the data saying? So how do you envision moving forward as we are trying to, get the recommendations from being in a report to bring them to life? How do you see nonprofits such as YACE, who do both advocacy work and programming, academic institutions and ministries and federal and provincial departments working together? Like, what are your suggestions on creating better synergies to actually get to where we want to go?
Yeah, I would add the private sector into that equation as well.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah,
but
definitely.
I think that, if we identify social problems that we want to address, and you look at the different players that you've just put at the table, each is bringing a different perspective. Each has different, I don't want to say values, not the right word, that they're bringing to the table, but different things that can be leveraged in that partnership. So we use the example, academics, government, and organizations such as yours to address community safety and issues of violence, right? If we want to enhance community safety and we want to reduce violence, we identify exactly within that kind of broad realm what it is that we want to address. How do we do that? Well, first and foremost, you're on the ground, right? You're in communities. You have a sense of what the issues are and some of what is causing those issues. As academics, we have access to various resources, like intellectual resources, kind of like it's supports in terms of research supports that can help kind of validate what it is that you're seeing. So trying to identify what it is on a kind of broader scale. And government, of course, can support both in terms of providing financial resources, et cetera. So again, if we identify a specific problem, you're on the ground. We can conduct research in partnership, right? Collaborate to conduct research, gather data, quantitative and qualitative data, which can be then analyzed still in partnership with the organization, but at the kind of university level to inform government, who can channel funding, who can change laws, who can provide other forms of support. So I see this as like very much a symbiotic relationship. And then once that funding and those supports and those laws have been implemented, then we have to evaluate it, right? Yeah. So that's again where the partnership comes back. So to me, like, it's really about addressing a problem, identifying and addressing a problem, and doing that has to be done in a kind of like collaborative and symbiotic way. And we each coming with different perspectives, again, kind of different skill sets and resources that we bring to the table, and we need to utilize those. No one wants to see researchers from a university come into a community, do research, leave, publish some papers with that, and definitely say thank you very much with money that they got from the government to do so, right? Like, that's unethical, and that's really what's been happening over and over again for now hundreds of years, right? Yeah. This is not like just a decades-old problem, but this is a long-standing problem. But if we truly want to address the issues, this partnership model is really ideal. And bringing that private sector again, private sector resource piece is key. They have many times, private institutions that desire to help the public, perhaps because they're operating in those communities, perhaps just because they want to improve life in a city or in a country more generally. And so those resources, financial and otherwise, because opportunities can come from the financial sector too, if we think about what actually can stem the tide of violence and improve community safety. So a collaborative approach is really the only way forward.
Yeah, definitely. And shout out to North Pine Foundation, because they're doing some of that amazing work supporting community safety across the city with many organizations, including us. And like you said, sometimes there's less red tape or complexities involved, and it allows you to actually focus on the work.
Yeah. Yeah. And the City of Toronto Towards Peace, Heart of Man, we can't forget them. Definitely. Scott McKean and Mo and the amazing work they're doing around piloting this the most innovative initiative, which targets those who are at the core of producing violence.
Scott's been doing good work for a long time in the city. So.
Well, Scott was we already got Scott's episode out, so we know
Scott, Serena, Keisha, the team. They're absolutely incredible. Gun violence in our city is evident levels of disproportionality. As Black Canadians, we're 4% of the population, but 15% of victimization. We are 5% of the population of this province, but 25% of victimization. There are the social determinants, which we must acknowledge, but there's also factors such as social media that's playing a role in the escalation and the culture for retaliatory and get-back killings. What's your position on censorship? By that, we mean the ability to limit or to take down what folks post on their social media platform if we think the content is insidious or will spark a response that poses a danger to public safety.
So I'm generally not in support of censorship because, I think it can lead to a slippery slope, and we have to decide, who gets to censor, what do they get to censor, who does and who does not get censored. So if there's a blanket censorship, if you decide on a platform that we're simply not going to allow violent, sexual, or other forms of content, then I think that's okay. But I have a trouble with specific groups of people being targeted for censorship. So, I say that fully acknowledging the role that social media can play in the escalation of violence, because it's so quick, right? It is so public, and so many people can see it. So not only, do your ops see what you're saying about them, but so do other people publicly, and that can increase that retaliatory violence. So I recognize its problem, but I do take issue with, certain individuals or groups of people being censored. And so if we're going to take violent content off of a platform, we just take violent content off of a platform, or our government does not allow it within our jurisdiction, and that's the blanket. But, I think for specific groups and specific people, but I think that, in a situation where it's not being censored, how can it be utilized to then try and kind of interrupt and stem that violence, right? And so there are ways to do that. Ideally, like, we want to prevent, And now that's going to take some time, right? Like we just mentioned, the social determinants of justice, and there we're focusing on things like education, employment, housing, health, and mental health. You could drop $1 trillion into those different buckets today. We're still going to have issues related to the violence we're seeing now. Tomorrow, a month from now, and a few years from now, probably, they will take time. So what do we do in the interim, right? And so that's where, I think that the social media landscape can be, used to identify where issues are cropping up and trying to intervene. But yeah, as I've said, I have issue with kind of individual and group level censorship.
Yeah. And I mean, I understand where you're coming from, because, the whole debate around whether rap lyrics can be used to convict someone. Yeah. It could be a slippery slope, although we can understand the intentions. We know that has been exploited, for example, in the United States.
It has been, and in the absence of other forms of evidence, right? Yes. I think that's the key piece. Like, you can't just take what someone says and then, in such a forum, given the fact that people say lots of things that aren't true in those forums and use it as evidence against them. And I think that's part of the problem in what has been happening, is that those lyrics in and of themselves become the evidence in the absence of other tangible pieces of evidence that would be usual in, like a homicide or other kind of violent case. Yeah,
definitely. Want to pivot to kind of talk about something that is more of a specific strategy or a tool, perhaps. IRCAs, known as Impact of Race and Cultural Assessments. You've been doing some great work in that area with Dr. Carl James. I know at YACE, we've partnered up with the African Nova Scotian Justice Institute in August. We held a training session for Black social workers to write IRCAs for those who need it. So can you maybe give us a high-level summary of what are IRCAs for folks who are not familiar, and where do you see as some of the challenges and how we can move it forward to be an effective tool?
So impact of race and culture assessments, or enhanced pre-sentence reports, as they're also often known, are reports that are developed about individuals who are being sentenced for an offense. So they've been convicted of a crime and they're being sentenced. In this context, IRCAs and enhanced pre-sentence reports are used for Black individuals who've come into conflict with the law and are being sentenced. And it provides, as it said, the court, the judge, and other decision makers with information about that person's background that wouldn't typically be included in a pre-sentence report, particularly related to the Black experience. And this is building on the work that's been done for Indigenous peoples with GLADU reports, acknowledging that the legacy of colonialism, residential schools, the reservation system, and other forms of racism that Indigenous people have and continue to experience increases their likelihood of coming into conflict with the law, either because it increases their levels of surveillance by the police and their experiences with heightened forms of discrimination within the justice system itself, as well as the fact that we know that the social conditions within which Black and, as I said, Indigenous people live are more likely to be conducive to crime. Now, I say that, I want to take a step back and say that's not to say that all Black people are criminal, because we have, lower graduation rates and higher rates of unemployment. But statistically speaking, we are more exposed to what we call criminogenic factors. And those are kind of the social determinants we've talked about before. So these IRCAs and enhanced pre-sentence reports provide the courts with information about how an individual's kind of life history has been affected by anti-Black racism, for example, at the structural, at the institutional, and even at the individual level, how that's influenced their life choices, their life chances, and contributed to the offense which they've undertaken. And then I think importantly, provides the court with the types of and options that would help rehabilitate and reintegrate that person back into society if they are incarcerated, or alternatives to incarceration if they are not incarcerated. So I think they're a very useful tool. One of the things that I've really struggled with as I got further on in my career is, like, why didn't I go into child welfare education? Because I deal with things at the back end of the system. Like, we have to talk about the social determinants of justice, but people don't just end up in the justice system, right? There's a lot that's got them there. And one of the issues with IRCAs I see is that we're identifying these problems and trying to provide these supports after someone's been convicted of a crime. Right? And so there's a lot of money that's been flowing into these and a lot of attention that's been flowing towards them. And I think they are very valuable, and I most definitely think they have a place. And as you've said, I've been doing a lot of work. I wrote with Carl James, a report amended to the Morris decision, which was one of the first two kind of significant decisions in Ontario in which these were used, and that has been impactful. And, Morris has been cited hundreds of times in other court cases. IRCAs are increasingly being adopted. And I do think that they should, but again, I think we need to think about where it is that they're implemented and how we use the limited resources that we have.
Yeah, I know with IRCAs, we're really pushing to not just get the report, but what happens after the report. So we're really advocating at YACE that we have to ensure those folks are connected with organizations that provides culturally responsive, trauma-informed to address the risk factors, to your point,
exactly,
so that they don't reoffend, or else it becomes a jail-free card, which some people interpret it as.
And that's it's not supposed to be that whatsoever, right?
Yeah.
Like, people think it's a race-based discount because we know that there's racism in our society, and that contributes to overrepresentation in the justice system. It's like, okay, you're black, well, let's take some time off your sentence. That's not what it is. And part of my hopes actually is, and this is why I am so in support of IRCAs as well, is that by calling for, by advocating for, by demanding that those culturally appropriate, trauma-informed services are provided to people who've come into conflict with the law, we create a greater demand for those. We create greater knowledge about those, and we create more opportunity for people to enter that space. And those services that can then be provided as well, to a greater extent than they are now, to people who are not yet justice involved. Because that, again, prevention's the better cure.
Yeah,
definitely. I mean, that's a good segue for the next question as it relates to the youth, some of the youth issues that we have. In 2021, nationally, we had 31 youth homicides.
Yeah.
In 2022, 90, an increase of 65%. Many are calling for a complete overhaul of the youth, of the YCGA, the Youth Criminal Justice Act. What's your position on that? Like, for example, they're saying that if you commit violent offenses, you should be sentenced or be dealt with in the criminal justice system as an adult, or these violent carjackings. What's your opinion on that?
Young people who are treated as adults are not only more likely to experience various forms of violence, if they're incarcerated, for example, various forms of violence within correctional institutions, and have a more traumatic experience, but that their chances of committing further crime are elevated, right? So I think that we have a YCGA and structured in the way that we do for a reason. And for me, there are problems with the YCGA. For example, when it came in, one of the big things that was included were the diversionary measures, right? Kind of pre-charge and pre-sentence diversions, right? So it was big on diversion. What we saw very clearly in the data available is that white youth were benefiting from that in a way that Black and Indigenous youth weren't. That's a problem I see with the YCGA. For me, noting the statistics that you've just mentioned, yes, young people receive lesser sentences than adults for committing the same types of offenses, but we recognize that their brains are not yet quite so developed that they do not fully recognize the consequences. We know that adults will use young people to engage in serious crime because they know they get a lesser sentence, and that's a problem to deal with. But I'm going to go back to what has happened in our society more generally that is making, why are more youth engaging in these types of crime? As a result, what are the social factors that are contributing to young people doing this, as opposed to what is the law that would stop them from doing so? Do you really think that young person, if they knew that they would get 8 as opposed to 2 years, would not engage in some of those offenses? Some may not, but a lot of this is an opportunity, right? Or perceived lack of opportunity.
Yeah.
And so I go back to let's deal with the social conditions that are contributed to young people engaging in these things in the first place, rather than trying to deal with how we punish them afterwards.
Thanks for that.
And I would say, the YCGA is over 20 years old now.
Yeah.
It could use some review. There's no doubt about that, right? But I don't think that the treating young people as adults is going to solve these problems. If that was the case, the U.S. would be a really safe society.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking of, from the Youth Criminal Justice Act to the federal framework to reduce recidivism, which is a little bit newer in the Canadian context, and it does have some components. I know, we feel the community safety aspect is missing, the safety lens, but I'm going to combine that with some of the work you've been doing and looking at drug legalization. And we know, in Canada, marijuana was legalized and it has its pros and cons, but Based on your research, and what is your take on, is that creating safer communities through decriminalization, but also is it having perhaps implication where the drug is more accessible? So what are your thoughts on how things have evolved since the legalization here in Canada?
Yeah, I think we may have a big problem with access, and I think we may be seeing that even worse with alcohol right now, with alcohol in convenience stores. You know, when the government introduced legalization, they did so because they recognized criminalizing people was not the right approach, and they wanted to advance a public health approach to kind of cannabis and cannabis use. We know that cannabis use, especially heavy cannabis use, is correlated, connected to some pretty serious mental health issues, right? Up into and including schizophrenia. I'm a big proponent of drug legalization, not just of cannabis, but of all drugs. But in saying that, I recognize the harms of those drugs. I think, unfortunately, the way in which we've been dealing with them for the last 100 or so years is more harmful than other ways that we could be dealing with them. And part of that actually, again, comes back to that access. You know, like cannabis, like, is it more or less accessible? Like, I don't know, depending on what part of the city you're in. You know, it may be just as accessible now as it was previously. But yeah, undoubtedly, we have a lot of retail outlets. And importantly as well, we have it in formats that we didn't have before. So in really high potency, high THC formats, shatter, even the vape pens. And so that's problematic. So, you know, in terms of the review, and in terms of where things are at on that point, I would agree that we need to consider whether people generally, and young people in particular, have greater access to cannabis than they should, and then think about, like, if we were to kind of restrict access in a greater way while still making it legal, while still having it legally available, would that push people back into kind of the illegal market? Because if we take legalization away, the illegal market's going to come back. And we know with illegal markets, a whole host of problems come with that, from crime and violence, of course, to, you know, like, what's even in the product.
Definitely. Well, we got time for about 2 more questions. I mean, I want to just quickly mention, you know, we are leading up. We're really blessed to be working with you. You know, we're working with a multi-stakeholder project, the Justice Data Modernization Initiative. You know, we have you as a consultant, along with Ipsos, along with Statistics Canada, and, you know, we have revised all the data we collect through our programs, and we are trying to do some data linkage to see how longitudinally and over time we can do some prevention work. And to your point, you know, it's always good to do prevention. So, you know, education programs, sports programs, how do all of those deter someone from criminality and having access to a caring adult? So, you know, what are your thoughts around maybe just projects like this, and where do you see the data taking us? Because sometimes the gap has been the lack of data or the inaccessibility.
Yeah, and again, it's interesting, like in this field, like, your community is often very well aware of the problems that academics and organizations try to deal with, right? And I get, because I've been advocating for various forms of data for a long time, and I often get pushback, but like, without data and high quality data, we can't fully assess a problem. We can't assess, as I've said before, kind of the trends, whether things are getting better or worse, and evaluate initiatives that we might implement to try and deal with those problems. So, you know, the project that you've just talked about, I think is a perfect example of those, like, multi-sectoral partnerships, right? We've got 2 significant government partners involved, university researcher, private sector organization providing further research support, then a community organization that has deep roots in a community that is able to leverage the work that it has been doing and improve the work that it hopes to do through this work, and inform government as well. You know, as you said, we're looking to modernize the way that the data that the government's getting, but you've already talked about how this is changing your own data collection practices too.
Yes.
And so these types of models across sectors and on different issues, I think, is something that we should see more of going forward. And again, the goal is to promote community safety and to address issues of crime and violence and issues within the justice system itself. And it's going to take, you know, these partnership approaches to doing those.
Yeah, well, thank you. We're really happy to be working together.
Yeah, so anything else you'd like to add?
I
as it
just
relates to,
like for me, it's a pleasure to be here. We've known each other for we've crossed paths for a very, very, very long time, and similarly, and so it's good to be able to actually engage in something meaningful. I think it's wonderful that you're doing this, because again, you get to not only talk about the work that you do and your various perspectives and experiences, but have people on the show that bring others as well. So I want to say thank you for having me here, and I hope to see not only many more episodes, but hopefully seasons. You're going to season this and on moving forward.
Yeah, awesome. So I'll end with a curveball. We always try to throw one curveball, and the curveball is, if you can give your young self, your teenage self, some advice, given all that you've done. You mentioned you thought about what sectors to go to. What kind of advice would you give someone trying to maybe figure out who they want to become or what they want to do, and they're experiencing kind of violence and discrimination, and they're at a low point in life, kind of?
Yeah, I think like this is an interesting one. I think about this a lot, actually. Like, unless you got lots of money, you got to work to live, right? And it's always easier to do something that you're passionate about. And so for me, trying to find a balance between what's going to pay the bills and put food on the table and the types of things that you're interested in doing. A lot of people in this country experience a lot of kind of destitution, a lot of troubling situations, and the same is true for people around the world. But we do have opportunities out there, and so again, trying to balance that. What can I do to put food on the table with what is likely to be meaningful for me, and how can I do something that might help me contribute to society in addition to putting food on the table. I'm very happy with where I ended up in terms of like the work that I do. I did not anticipate being here, and it's been fortunate. And I have had periods of my life where I wasn't sure what it was that I was going to do, and my opportunities most certainly did seem to be blocked. But so I think perseverance would be key as well, and trying to find mentors and people who can help you not only explore the world and opportunities, but get you through hard times too.
That's amazing advice. That's the nuances of balancing it, but I think a really good compass to guide your decision making. So anything else you got, D, before we wrap it up?
Yeah, just again, thank you for the work that you do. I mean, advocacy at the academic level is important, because you're giving institutions rich context, and departments of government and ministries rich context about what exists, right? So I mean, there's a level of apathy usually because they don't know, but you're letting them know that we know. So by letting them know that, by communicating that knowledge to them, we know who's apathetic and who's not, right? So the document exists. If you haven't had a chance to read the document, please read that report. It's quite a concise and extensive document that really lists real impactfully what we can do better.
Well, thank you. Appreciate you coming by.
Thank you.
Enough love.
Thank you, sir.